The paper felt brittle as onion skin folded so tight the creases had turned the color of tea. On the outside, a child's hand had written 4 careful words, "For Mom from Benny." I remember holding that note under the thin light of a motel lamp, the air smelling like warm dust and old Freon, and realizing the wall behind me wasn't just a wall. It was a memory with nails in it. Let me know where you're listening from and share this if you believe remembering is the first step toward justice. I live in a small walk-up no one would call glamorous 2 rooms above a deli in Brooklyn where the storefront lights paint the ceiling a soft orange at night. Most mornings start the same black coffee, a jog along the promenade if the humidity doesn't feel like soup, then a couple hours at the desk coaxing stories out of boxes and databases and people who never expected anyone to call. My show isn't slick. It's just me. A careful voice and a promise I try not to break if someone's name faded before it should have. I will say it until the sound catches. When the lead pulled me west that August, it did so the way a map pulls a finger straight line, no frills. Elko County sits in high desert that knows heat like an old habit. The drive in off the interstate felt longer than the miles on the odometer, the way miles do when the horizon keeps backing up. Sagebrush, a sky as wide as a stacked stadium, and the kind of silence that isn't empty so much as full of things that settled there and never left. By late afternoon, the thermometer on my truck had climbed over 100 degrees, and the light had that bleached western look that turns every shape into a cutout. I came to record ambient sound, first crickets, the thrum of a soda machine, the rattle of a vent when the compressor kicks on. You do that when you're telling a story that lives in a place most people will only ever hear. The Willow Pines Motel wasn't a destination. It was a pause on a road people take to reach somewhere else. 1 story tall, U-shaped around a gravel court, numbers stenciled by a steady hand that had learned to accept small flaws. A neon pine flickered above the office like it was fighting to stay lit. Moths worked the light as if they had union hours. Late summer out here has a sound tires crunching, a screen door sighing shut, wind combing through dry weeds. I grew up far from this kind of landscape, but I recognized the rhythm immediately. In towns like this, people still wave from their porches with 2 fingers lifted from the steering wheel. The grocery clerk knows when you switch brands. A stranger stands out the way a bright shirt does at a funeral, not unwelcome, just seen. The woman behind the counter at the office watched me with a squint that said she'd learned to measure folks by how they listened, not how they talked. I introduced myself, said I was there to collect history, not to pry up floorboards. She slid a brass key across the counter, the way you'd slide responsibility. Room 104 sat on the end under a warped awning that had given up keeping much shade. The door stuck half an inch from swollen paint. I had to lean against it with a shoulder. Inside, the air was cool and smelled like conditioner and the ghost of cigarettes. A queen bed, a scarred dresser bolted to the wall, a square TV that pretended to be modern. Sunlight pushed through thick tan curtains and turned into a quiet glow that held its breath. Everywhere I looked, I saw ordinary a chain lock polished bright by 1,000 thumbs, a phone with a sticker telling you how much a local call costs a washcloth folded into a triangle, like a promise someone kept even when no one checked. I set my recorder on the nightstand and let it run. I don't talk at first. I let the room announce itself. There's a trick to hearing a place you quit, filling it with your own noise. The AC hissed from the wall unit near the window, the compressor cut, the coil ticked, and the room settled back into itself. That was the moment I always wait for, the second when a space either gives you nothing or gives you one small, honest sound. In 104, it gave me both. First, the quiet you expect in a building that's seen more sunrises than guests. Then under it, the faintest chatter, a kind of undertone, not voices exactly, but the feeling of words that might have been there once. I shook it off and did what I always do. I laid out cables and batteries like a medic setting up a field kit. I checked the mic levels. I walked the couple of miles to the gas station for a jug of water because the morning heat had lapped into evening like a dog that doesn't know when to stop. Coming back, a man hosed dust off the office steps. He nodded, then tilted the hose so it arced across the gravel. The water made a dark crescent that flashed and vanished almost as soon as it landed. "Going to cool off tonight," he said. "Down to 80. Around here, that counted as mercy." I've learned to look for people, not clues. People remember the rhythm of a week better than a single day. That evening, I sat on the office bench and traded small talk with a woman named Marianne Lillis, who smelled faintly of cold coffee and motel soap. She grew up here, worked the desk the way kids work a family counter when summer's long and money is short. She told me about the year the sign burned out and stayed that way until a traveling electrician fixed it for $40 in a room. We didn't talk about 1984, not yet. We talked about the way the wind comes off the hills and slaps the line of cottonwoods like wet laundry. About fishermen who book a room, set their alarm for 4:30 a.m., then never show at the river anyway. About the baseball games you can catch on AM at night if you aim the antenna just so. Back in my room, I phoned home. There's comfort in a familiar voice, even for someone who's made a life out of listening to strangers. I described the desert light the way you describe a painting to someone who can't see it right then. We talked about bills and a cracked tile I keep forgetting to fix. There's a magic to small household things when you're stepping into long shadows on purpose. The squeak of a kitchen cabinet, the soft thud of mail on the hallway rug, ice pinging the sides of a glass. Those are the sounds that say you can set your worry down for a while. I didn't set mine down. Not completely. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a feeling you get when two facts in a room lean away from each other. The curtains were heavy enough to block most of the light, but a narrow seam near the rod let a stripe through an angled blade of sun that crept along the ceiling and stopped short of the far corner, as if it meant to finish the job and didn't. In that same corner, a metal vent cover sat a little sideways. It could have been a careless repair. It could have been nothing. The screws didn't match. One head was bright and new, the other's dull as old nickels. I took a picture because that's what habit does. It writes things down even when your head says you're being fussy. The town wound down the way small towns do. Trucks eased through the lot, settled into spaces like cattle, finding shade doors shut. Conversations faded to porch level. Somewhere a radio played Merle Haggard so low it sounded like a memory, not a song. I walked the perimeter once, counting steps out of boredom and out of a need to know where the dark started. The air cooled to something you could call bearable. Heat makes noise. When it drops, you feel the silence like a hand on the shoulder. A young couple argued under their breath 2 doors down about whether to keep driving or just sleep and finish it in the morning. Somebody's dog dreamed and made the soft chuffing sound dogs make when they run after something their paws can't catch. I set the alarm for 6:00 a.m. I planned to start with room tone, and then a visit to the county building permits ledgers the dry paper trail that keeps a story honest. I wrote the plan on an index card because putting a plan on paper is how you tell your nerves they work for you, not the other way around. Before lights out, I set the recorder on a low floor stand and let it roll. I always do that in old rooms. Sometimes all you get is a compressor cycling and a truck downshifting on the highway. Sometimes you get the kind of click you can explain with temperature and metal fatigue. Either way, the tape keeps you from imagining things. I lay on top of the covers and watched the ceiling fan pull at the air. It couldn't move blades, making a shape like a slow propeller. The wall unit breathed cool and then rested. The rest periods grew a little longer as the desert lost its grip. My mind circled the same easy-track county maps, last names, dates, whatever I could collect without disturbing anything more than necessary. Someone had lived a life in this room before the world knew their name, and nothing good comes from storming a place that has learned to stay quiet. I thought about Joanne Langridge, though I hadn't met her yet. Just a voice through a line months before, cautious but steady. There's a particular kind of resolve you hear in mothers who keep a porch light on bright enough to find the steps. Not so bright, it keeps the neighbors awake. She once told a local anchor she would not move because a boy lost in this world might make his way back by remembering the sight of home. The clip was grainy, the edges of her words blurred by an old camera. Still, the sentence reached me the way straight talk does. You hear clarity, you stand up straighter. I didn't open the laptop. Not yet. I wanted to let the place teach me its sounds before I started searching names in a glow that doesn't belong to any town. I listened to the lot. A distant freight horn bent around the hills like something calling from another time zone. A pickup eased in and idled long enough to make me picture a man sorting coins for a soda he didn't need. Somewhere a screen door slapped twice opened, then changed its mind. Ordinary, all of it, the kind of ordinary that makes you feel safe enough to shift onto your side and let everything else slide. Before I killed the lamp, I crossed the room and put my palm flat against the wall between 104 and 105. It wasn't a ritual, and it wasn't a test. It was just a way of saying hello to the next day. The paint felt cool, then warm where the AC drifted and pooled. No vibration, no hum, just the faint texture of roller marks left by whoever last touched up the scuffs. When I took my hand away, a square of light from the seam at the curtain clipped my knuckles and turned them bone white. I remember thinking I'd ask for fresh batteries in the morning and pick up a jug of orange cleaner because the desk said the maid had a preference, and it felt right to leave a tip and the product she liked. I slid the chain into the keep and clicked the deadbolt more out of habit than concern. I set the key on the nightstand next to a folded 20 for housekeeping. I stood for a moment listening for traffic on the highway. When none came, I realized I'd learned the timing already. Trucks in a loose pack just after 10, then nearly nothing until a heavy driver pushes through around midnight. The porch bulb outside my window threw a wan circle of light that didn't reach the far corner. It flickered once and held. I switched off the lamp. The room fell into that motel dark that isn't truly dark because the world never quite leaves you alone. Across the lot, somebody's television murmured a late baseball score. The AC sighed and went still. Past the window, heat left the gravel in waves you couldn't see, but could feel like a stove turned down but not off. I waited for sleep and told myself I wasn't waiting for anything else. From the far corner, nothing. From the hallway shoes on concrete somewhere, then quiet. The phone did not ring. The porch light stayed on longer than it needed to, and the vent on the wall tilted just enough to notice caught a sliver of glow and held it like an eye that hadn't decided to blink. That night in Willow Pines stretched longer than I expected. I remember waking up once sometime after 2 when the air conditioner cut off and the room went still enough to hear the highway half a mile away. I rolled onto my side, trying to fall back asleep, but the silence had a pulse to it, a faint rhythm I couldn't place. Metal cooling, maybe, or a vent shifting in the heat. I told myself it was nothing. But by dawn, that nothing had started to feel like a thread waiting to be pulled. I was out early, just after 6, walking the property, with a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm before I finished it. The desert light was pale and forgiving at that hour-long shadows running across the gravel like painted lines. The office door was propped open, the smell of pine sol spilling out. The same man from the night before sat behind the counter reading another paperback with a Western on the cover. He barely looked up when I asked for a copy of my receipt. I could tell he'd seen my kind before the true crime types, the ones who come looking for ghosts in the name of journalism. He asked what I hoped to find, not kindly, but not unkindly either. I told him the truth. Maybe nothing. Maybe something that explains the nothing. He gave a short laugh, the kind people give when they want you to know you're wasting your time. "Drama's already in the walls," he muttered, same as he'd said the night before. And there it was again, that line thrown off like small talk but heavy enough to leave a dent. By mid-morning, I was back in 104 with my equipment. I'd done this routine 100 times before, check levels, log sound tests, take photos of every surface. But that day, every move felt deliberate slower, like I was walking across a frozen pond. I started by recording the ambient sound. The walls soaked it in instead of bouncing it back, which was odd for a room that size. I moved the mic closer to the vent in the corner where the paint had gone a shade lighter around the edges. A pair of mismatched screws held the cover in place. One was shiny, like it had been replaced recently. The other three were dulled over by years of dust. I raised the mic toward it, expecting the usual hollow whisper of airflow. Instead, I heard something else. A small mechanical stutter click-whir, pause so faint I thought it was feedback. I held my breath and listened closer. The rhythm came again steadier now, like a gear trying to catch, and under it just barely something that shouldn't have been there at all, a voice. High soft, almost swallowed by the hum of the unit. A child's voice. Just a few words, but I couldn't make them out. My hand jerked back, bumping the dresser behind me. The recorder slid off, hit the floor, and kept rolling. I replayed what it caught. Click, whir. Then a whisper so low it brushed against silence. Don't tell you. That's what it sounded like. Not clear, not certain, but real enough to lift the hair on my arms. I've done this long enough to know when my mind's filling in blanks. This wasn't that. There was something inside the wall or behind it, something mechanical, something human. I wrote down the timestamp, sat on the bed, and tried to steady my breathing. For a long minute, all I could hear was the slow tick of the recorder's red light. I told myself to be rational, maybe a cross-current of sound from the next room, maybe a vibration traveling through the ductwork, maybe even an old wiring loop feeding static into the microphone. But reason doesn't erase instinct. I packed my bag, left the recorder running, and stepped outside. The parking lot shimmered under the heat, every car reflecting the same white glare. Across the courtyard, the elderly woman I'd seen the night before was smoking again, her elbows resting on the railing like she'd been there all night. When I passed, she looked at me and said, "You're here for the Langridge boy, aren't you?" I stopped. "You mean Benny?" She nodded once, ash drifting off her cigarette. "I stayed in that room the night after it happened," she said. Could still feel the cold in the sheets. Her tone wasn't dramatic, just matter-of-fact, like she was telling me the weather from 30 years ago. Before I could ask her anything else, she flicked the butt into the dirt and went back inside. I waited until dark to go back in. Something about the vent had been gnawing at me all day, the way it sounded hollow even when I knocked lightly. I figured if I was going to check it, I'd rather not draw attention. The clerk already thought I was a nuisance. At 10, I shut off the lamp, set the flashlight in my teeth, and climbed onto the bed. The screws came loose with almost no effort, like someone had already loosened them years before. When the cover fell into my hand, the smell hit first, a stale metallic rot, the scent of insulation and long-trapped dust. I reached inside, fingers brushing cold metal, then something square and smooth. Plastic. I pulled out a cassette. The label was yellowed, the ink faded, but 2 words were still legible. Room 104, do not erase. My first thought was that it had belonged to the family. Benny's mother had once said her son recorded things when he was anxious. Rain sounds her voice, sometimes just silence. But when I looked closer, the tape wasn't one of the cheap brands you'd buy for a kid. It was professional grade, the kind used for studio dictation. I slipped it into my portable player. At first only static, then a child's voice. "It's cold. I want the nightlight on." A man's voice followed, quiet, almost kind. "You remember what we said about that, Benny? The night is just pretend." There was a pause. The boy again hesitant. "Can I have my book?" The man replied. "We don't read in the princess room." The word princess came out like a rule, not a nickname. My stomach turned. The tone wasn't fatherly, it was practiced measured, someone trying to keep a child under control. Then the man said, "Say it again, Benny." The boy whispered, "This isn't real. The night is pretend." The man repeated, louder. The child obeyed. I shut the recorder off, sat there staring at the vent. The air in the room felt heavier, as if the walls themselves had been listening. Whoever that man was, he'd been in this exact room, maybe even sitting where I was sitting, teaching that boy how to believe in nothing. I ran the tape back, listened again. Near the end, another voice appeared, older, rougher, with a hint of a smirk. "You're recording these now?" the second man asked. "In case he forgets," the first answered. "Sometimes he pretends to forget." The second man said, "That's risky." The first man's voice dropped low. "Not if you hide them right. I'll put this one behind the vent." The line repeated in my head until it felt carved there. "I'll put this one behind the vent." I stopped the player and sat very still. No air conditioner. Hum now, no passing cars, just the creak of the old building settling into the heat. I realized my hands were trembling. This wasn't a ghost story. It was evidence. I wrote down everything, time details, the make of the cassette, the brand, even the tone of the voices. My notes were a mess, my handwriting looping over itself. I didn't know whether to feel grateful or horrified that the tape had survived. Around 1 in the morning, I uploaded the recording to a backup drive. Old habit redundancy keeps the truth alive. Then I checked my messages. A listener had replied to a teaser I'd posted earlier that day. It said, "Are you still in Elko County? If you are, go check room 105. I stayed there in 99. There's something in the wall between us. The username was Before You Wake 88. I didn't answer. I just stared at the screen. By sunrise, I'd made up my mind to stay another day. I walked back to the office, asked the clerk if there were any maintenance records for the room's plumbing wiring, anything from the 80s. He gave me a look halfway between suspicion and resignation, then pointed to a door behind the counter. "My father kept everything he said. If you find something worth reading, good for you." Inside, the air smelled of mildew and motor oil. Old ledgers were stacked like bricks against the wall. I pulled down the one labeled 1984 and flipped to October. There it was, room 104, registered to an A. Shepherd Cash, 2 nights. The signature slanted neat and confident. A page earlier, same handwriting, different name, J. Mills. Then again, 2 months later, G. Harmon. Each entry tied to the same room, always in cash, always with a different alias. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air. Whoever he was, he'd been careful enough to build himself 3 versions. 3 names, 1 man. When I asked to make copies, the clerk shrugged. "Machine's dead, but you can take pictures if you want." So I did every page, every line. Back in my room, I spread the photos on the bed and started drawing connections. The pattern was obvious once I stopped thinking like a reporter and started thinking like a traveler. Each visit came 6 to 8 weeks apart. It wasn't random. It was scheduled. A ritual, almost. I matched the dates to missing children in the state that year. 3 names stood out. Kids gone missing within a day of each booking: a girl from Battle Mountain, a boy from Wells, another from Ely. All within 100 miles. Each case labeled runaway or custody dispute closed before it began. The pattern was too clean to be coincidence. Room 104 wasn't just where one child vanished, it was a hub, a revolving door for something much darker. That afternoon, the desert light burned white across the windows, flattening everything in sight. I sat there in that same stale air, the recorder still on, and said out loud the words that had been turning in my head since I found the tape. They weren't just using this room. They were hiding in it. I looked at the vent again, its mouth open now, its edges dark with dust. Behind that thin layer of wallboard had lived a secret that no one had tried hard enough to hear. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled off the mountains, faint and low, like a memory coming up for air. I gathered my notes, closed the blinds, and told myself I'd rest. But the recorder kept blinking on the nightstand, red and patient, waiting for the next sound. When I finally turned off the light, I could still hear that faint click and whir echoing in my ears, steady, mechanical, impossible to forget. It wasn't until I closed my eyes that I realized it wasn't coming from the wall anymore. It was coming from the recorder itself, still running, still hearing. And beneath that hum, somewhere inside the layers of tape and static, a small, tired voice whispered again. It said something I couldn't quite catch. But I knew one thing for certain: the room hadn't gone quiet. Not yet. Morning crept in like it always does in the desert, slow gold and unforgiving. The light hit the side of the motel and turned the stucco the color of sandpaper. I hadn't slept. My recorder was still running on the nightstand, its little red light blinking through the dark like a steady heartbeat. The vent sat open across the room, a square of shadow that looked deeper now that I knew what had been hidden inside. The tape. Benny's voice, the man's calm replies, still looped in my head. When you listen to something like that, it doesn't fade. It stays behind your eyes, waiting for quiet. I got up, ran the water until it sputtered brown to clear, and let it splash across my face. The mirror was warped and cracked near the frame. It made me look older than 46, the kind of older that doesn't wash off. By 8, the desert was already heating back up air dry as chalk. I took my coffee to the office, the same cup I'd been using since the drive out, and asked the manager if there was a place in town that still kept old business records. He didn't look surprised. He'd probably guessed why I was there by now. My father kept ledgers, he said finally. In the back room. Don't touch the plumbing boxes. The smell hit me the moment I opened the door, old paper and machine oil, heavy and sweet. There were stacks of ledgers along the wall, warped from years of summer humidity. The handwriting changed every few books, each one labeled in faded ink. I found 1984, brushed the dust off the cover, and flipped through the pages until I hit October. My stomach tightened as the names started repeating in a rhythm: J. Mills, G. Harmon, A. Shepard. All cash. All room 104. The same loops of handwriting months apart. And on the 13th, the date of Benny's disappearance, it was that last one, A. Shepard. I don't remember breathing for a while. I just stared at the page, at that small, practiced signature, the calm of it. Whoever he was, he hadn't been afraid to sign his name. He'd been careful, but not hiding, at least not in a way that looked like panic. He'd been methodical. The realization came slow, like something sinking through water. Benny wasn't the first. He was one of many. I took pictures of every page, my hands shaking as I worked the camera. When I asked the manager if he knew anything about those names, he gave a small shrug. Those all before my time, he said. My father ran this place back then. Quiet man, kept to himself. I asked where his father was now, and he pointed toward the hills outside town. Buried, he said. 2 years. Then, after a pause, he said, once there was a man who liked that corner room. Paid cash. Drove a brown truck. Always tipped my mother $5. Guess that's not much of a crime, though. Back in my room, I pinned the photographs to my corkboard, each name, each date. I sat on the bed, tracing the timeline with a pen. Every few months, the same pattern. Every stay followed by a missing child within a day's drive of the motel. It wasn't random. It was a route, a rotation. That was when I called Mary Ann Lalis. She was the one the older woman had mentioned, the daughter of the original owner. She picked up after 2 rings, her voice low and raspy from years of smoke. I told her who I was and what I'd found. There was a pause, then she said, "If you want to talk about that room, you can come here. I don't do motel visits." Her house was 20 minutes out of town, a single-story place surrounded by junipers and heat haze. A chain-link fence rattled when I pulled up. She answered the door before I knocked, wearing jeans and a t-shirt that said, "World's Okayest Mom." Her eyes had the tired shine of someone who'd seen too much of the same view. Inside, the air was cooler heavy with the smell of old carpet and cigarettes. "You said room 104, she began, easing into a chair that creaked under her. "That's the one everybody asks about. The boy, right, Benny?" I nodded. "My dad told me not to talk about it when it happened," she said. "Said bad things stick to people who go looking for them." She lit a cigarette, the flame flickering against the smoke-yellowed walls. "But I remember him, the man. He came every few months just like clockwork. Paid in cash, carried this blue duffel bag, never let it out of his sight. He smelled like lemon cleaner, sharp enough to sting your eyes." I asked if she remembered his name. She exhaled smoke and shook her head. "He changed it every time. Harmon, Shepherd, Mills, whatever fit the week. But it was always him. You could tell by his eyes. One was glass, the left, I think. Looked just a little too smooth in the light. That stopped me cold. I hadn't heard that detail before, not in any report." "A glass eye," I repeated. She nodded. "You notice a thing like that once you don't forget. My dad tried to help him once lift that duffel bag into his car, and the man snapped. Calm voice, but hard. Told him not to touch what wasn't his." I played her a short clip from the cassette, the man's voice saying, "The night is pretend." Her cigarette froze halfway to her lips. "That's him," she said quietly. "That's the man with the bag." She looked down at the ashtray, eyes wet but steady. "He tipped me once. $10. Told me I had a helpful face. I was 15. I left her house with that voice echoing in my head. By the time I got back to the motel, the sun had turned the sky to brass. Inside, the air felt thick again, that stillness that comes before something you can't name. I walked to the far corner of the room, the wall between 104 and 105. The dimensions had been bothering me since the night I arrived. From outside, the building looked symmetrical, but 104 was shorter by about 3 feet. I tapped the wall, hollow. I measured it out, pacing carefully. It wasn't just an irregularity. There was a cavity back there, a space built between rooms. My stomach sank. It wasn't a maintenance gap. It was deliberate. A hidden section, maybe 3 feet deep. I pressed my palm flat to the drywall, half expecting to feel something move, but it was cold and still. I kept my voice low as I recorded the log possible concealed chamber between 104 and 105. Dimensions suggest enough space for storage or confinement. The word tasted wrong in my mouth, but there it was. That night, I sat outside the room watching the neon sign buzz through the heat. The light flickered against the gravel moths, throwing their tiny shadows across the wall. I thought about the boy sitting in here all those years ago, listening to a man tell him the world was pretend. I thought about his mother, how she'd probably stood right where I was calling his name into that same dark, waiting for an answer that never came. The next morning, I drove out to her house. Joanne Langridge lived outside of Lemuel in a one-story home with faded yellow siding and a wind chime made from old spoons. She met me at the door, a small woman with silver hair pulled tight into a bun. Her voice was calm but tired. "You're the podcaster," she said, not as a question. Inside, the house was filled with the kind of stillness that comes from too many years without movement. Photos lined the mantel, Benny as a toddler, Benny in a red jacket at 7. She kept the blinds half closed, the light soft and dusty. "I've never moved," she said. "Told myself if he ever came home he should know where to find me." I told her I'd found a tape. Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't speak. I asked if I could play it. She nodded once, slow, when Benny's voice filled the room. "It's cold. I want the nightlight on her hands tightened on the armrest." She didn't cry at first. She just listened. When the man said, "Say it again." "Benny." She closed her eyes. tears slipping down her cheeks without a sound. "That voice," she whispered finally. "He sounds familiar." I told her about the aliases, the glass eye, the lemon cleaner. She went pale, set her hand against her mouth. "I remember now," she said. "The night we checked in, there was a man in the parking lot. Benny was upset, didn't want to leave the car. The man offered to help carry our bag. He had gloves on, white cotton gloves. Said he stayed here a lot." Her voice broke on the next word. He smiled at Benny. I showed her a picture of a man I'd found in an old church bulletin from 1983, a youth pastor named Paul Harkner. She stared at it, then looked away. "That's him," she said softly, "or someone who looked just like him. When Benny went missing, he came back, stood across the parking lot watching us. I told the police, but they said I was in shock. We stood outside afterward by her clothesline. The wind pushed the sheets around like ghosts." "You think he was the only one?" she asked quietly. I didn't know how to answer. "No," I said finally. "I think there were more. Before I left, she gave me a small box from her attic. It's all I have left," she said. Inside were Benny's drawings, a few old toys, and one red cassette labeled in a child's hand. For Mom, room 104. That night, back in the motel, I couldn't bring myself to play it yet. Instead, I set the recorder on the table and spoke quietly into the mic. "There's a hidden space between these rooms," I said. "A cavity built into the wall just wide enough for a person. Whoever used it knew exactly what they were doing. The man with the duffel, the one with the glass eye, he built it for a reason. Maybe for storage. Maybe for something worse." I sat there until the tape ran out, the last of the light leaving the window. The room smelled faintly of lemon now, though I hadn't cleaned a thing. The vent, still open, looked darker than before, the edges sharp in the lamplight. I turned toward it, and for a long moment I thought I heard it again, that faint, rhythmic click and whir rising from somewhere deep inside the wall. It was probably the compressor. Probably. But the sound carried a shape to it this time, like a heartbeat pressed through metal. I turned off the recorder and waited. The air didn't move. And then, in that hush that only desert nights know how to hold, the sound came once more, softer, slower. 3 tiny knocks, like someone on the other side of the wall remembering how to answer. When morning came, it found me sitting on the carpet beside the bed, staring at the wall between rooms 104 and 105. I hadn't slept, not really. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard those 3 faint knocks echoing in the dark. I kept telling myself they were pipes or wind or some old mechanical rhythm buried in the structure. But the sound didn't feel like an accident. It felt like a memory replaying itself through the bones of the building. The light creeping through the curtains made the room look different now, smaller somehow, like the air itself had been changed. The vent I'd opened still gaped above the dresser, and the smell of dust and insulation clung to the place like it didn't want to leave. I knew I couldn't ignore what was behind that wall any longer. By 9, the maintenance crew had come and gone from room 105, leaving the door propped open with a cinder block. They were redoing the flooring, new plywood, new paint, the smell of fresh adhesive hanging heavy in the air. No one asked who I was when I walked in. The foreman just nodded and went for supplies. I waited until the sound of their truck faded down the highway before I started measuring. 3 feet shorter. That was the difference between the 2 rooms. 3 feet of missing space. The hollow sound when I knocked confirmed it. I brought my tools from the car, a small crowbar, a flathead screwdriver, a flashlight. The same kit I use for field recording setups. I pressed my ear to the wall first. Nothing. Then, after a long moment, a faint creak from somewhere deep inside, like wood expanding in heat. I started prying gently at the baseboard. The nails came out clean, too clean, like they'd been set and reset before. When the last one gave, I slid the crowbar higher, worked it under the drywall, and pulled until the sheet bent and cracked down the middle. Behind it was a layer of pink insulation compressed tight as a blanket. The smell that came out was unmistakable old air metal and something sour that had been sealed a long time. I peeled the insulation back slowly and shined my flashlight inside. There was a small wooden panel nailed shut with brass tacks. My hands were sweating by the time I got the first one loose. The panel came away in one piece, and I remember thinking whoever built it wasn't improvising. They'd measured, cut, and fitted it like they meant for it to last. Behind the panel was a box, cardboard water-stained the size of a child's shoebox. I pulled it out gently, set it on the bare plywood, and brushed away the dust. On the top, taped with yellowing Scotch tape, was a folded sheet of paper. I hesitated before touching it. Then I saw the handwriting, small, careful, uneven, like a child learning to stay inside the lines. Across the front were 4 words. For Mom from Benny. I don't think I breathed at all while I opened it. The letter inside was written in pencil, the words faint and shaky, but readable. Dear Mommy, I was good today. I didn't cry. I said the lines right. He says I can get a toy if I stop asking about home. I tried to yell, but the wall is thick. I think it's made special. The other man said, make it thicker this time. There's a light in here and a bear. I named him Cactus. Please find me. I'm right next to the room. I can still hear the TV sometimes. If you knock, I will knock back. I love you. Love, Benny. I must have read it 10 times before it truly hit me. He'd been alive long enough to write. He'd been right there just feet away from where his mother slept that night, calling for him through the wall. I set the paper down and realized my hands were shaking so badly I could hear the rustle of it. There was more inside the cavity. 3 cassette reels, 1 cracked, 1 half melted from heat, and 1 intact. Beneath them, a small red sock with a faded dinosaur print. The fabric was stiff with age. And carved into the wood near the bottom, a pattern of scratch marks, tiny uneven grooves running in parallel lines like a hand trying to find the edge of light. I crawled back out, sat against the bed frame, and pressed the record button on my own device. My voice sounded hollow in that room. Found a sealed cavity between 104 and 105, I said. Contains letter from Benny Langridge child's sock and 3 cassette reels. Evidence of confinement. Indications of resistant scratch marks consistent with fingernails. Conclusion. The wall was used as a chamber. It felt wrong saying the word chamber out loud, but there wasn't another one that fit. The air in the room had changed again. It felt weighted, almost living. I turned off the recorder and just sat there for a while, staring at that open space in the wall. Every now and then the wood inside creaked like something shifting its weight. Later that day, I took the letter and the tape to the county library to scan them for preservation. The archivist on duty was a woman named Mira Young, but serious, the kind who handles every document like it's made of glass. When she saw the signature on the building permit attached to the motel's 1982 renovation file, her brow furrowed. "This name," she said quietly. "Paul Harkner. He filed for the wall repair back then." The name hit me like a body blow. Harkner. The same youth pastor whose voice I was sure I'd heard on the first tape. We dug through the microfilm records, old permits, inspection logs. There it was again, his name attached to structural changes labeled soundproofing and vent relocation. I remember staring at those words until they blurred. It wasn't renovation. It was construction for concealment. That night I drove back out past the town limits to where the desert folds into foothills. The stars out there looked too close, too many of them. I stopped at a turnout and called Joanne Langridge. I told her about the letter, but not everything. Just that I'd found something written by her son. Something real. She didn't speak for a while. Then she asked, "Was he scared?" I didn't know how to answer. "He was brave," I said. He tried to leave you a way to find him. When I hung up, I sat in silence with the windows down, the night wind whistling through the door crack. It smelled like sage and rust. Somewhere out there was the next step. The name Echo Rock kept turning up in the recordings, and I had to find out what it meant. The next morning, I followed that trail. County property records listed an Echo Rock Youth Sanctuary, established 1981, owned by something called Holstead Behavioral Center. The director, Reverend Paul Harkner. The place was abandoned now, according to the county clerk, but the land deed was still active. I drove up through the Ruby Mountains, the road turning to gravel, then dirt climbing until the air thinned. The coordinates led me to a clearing where the trees bent in a half circle as if the wind had trained them that way. There, sitting quiet in the weeds, was what used to be a lodge, an A-frame with boarded windows and a sun-faded sign that still read Echo Rock. The door was half open, the hinges groaning when I pushed. Inside, the air was cold and stale, like the smell of basements and wet stone. The walls were painted a washed-out cream color, but faint handprints still showed through small and high-pressed into the paint. Child-sized. In one corner stood 3 rusted cots, stripped to their metal frames. I walked through, slowly recording the crunch of glass under my boots, echoing like footsteps behind me. At the back of the building was a door marked Reflection Room. It opened into a space no bigger than a walk-in closet. The floor was concrete, and the only light came from a hole in the roof where daylight cut in like a blade. On the far wall hung a crooked wooden cross. Below it, half buried in dust, was a VHS tape case. I picked it up, wiped it clean enough to read. The label said Phase 2, Final. I carried it outside, set it on a flat rock, and loaded it into a portable player I kept for field evidence. The image flickered to life, grainy monochrome. A child sat in a chair under a single overhead light, head down, feet barely touching the floor. I could see the same red dinosaur sock from the wall, the left one. The child was breathing shallowly, eyes glazed. Then, off camera, a man's voice spoke, Echo Rock. Phase 2, Subject 17. The child didn't answer. Another voice followed, calm, clinical. Do you remember where you came from? A pause. The princess room. The voice again. And what did the princess room teach you? The child lifted their head just enough to be heard. Not to ask. The tape kept playing, but I stopped it there. The sound of those 3 words filled everything, the wind, the trees, the blood in my ears. Not to ask. That's what they'd taught them. Silence as survival. I sat outside that lodge until the sun went down the mountains, turning violet, and the air dropping 20 degrees in an hour. Behind the building, half hidden in the brush, I found a line of small stone markers, each no bigger than a boot print. They weren't graves, not exactly, but each had an initial carved into it, CMB. I didn't need anyone to tell me what they stood for. Carrie Michael Benny. At the base of Benny's marker, I found a rusted tin box. Inside, on a piece of faded paper, a stick figure with wings and a red balloon drawn in crayon. Beneath it, in a child's handwriting, I'm still here. I don't remember driving back to the motel that night, only the sound of gravel under the tires and the way the headlights caught dust like falling snow. I couldn't shake the thought that this wasn't just about Benny anymore. This was a system organized, rehearsed, maybe still alive in some form. When I pulled into the lot, the neon sign was off for the first time since I'd arrived. The building looked hollow, almost peaceful. I walked up to my room, unlocked the door, and set my recorder on the table. Echo Rock was real, I said quietly into the mic. It was where they finished what they started here. The princess room wasn't just a place. It was training obedience, silence erasure. I paused, looking toward the vent. But one child resisted. He remembered long enough to write, long enough to hide proof, and maybe long enough to survive. I let the tape roll a little longer. The AC unit clicked on the same familiar hum. Then I heard it again, faint but clear. 3 soft taps somewhere behind the wall. I didn't move this time. I just whispered into the microphone, steady as I could. "I hear you." Then for the first time since I'd arrived, the sound stopped. The room exhaled, and the silence that followed felt less like fear and more like a promise. The days that followed blurred together in that strange way time does after you've seen something that can't be unseen. The FBI arrived first, then state investigators, then people I didn't know carrying cameras and evidence kits. By then, I'd already turned over everything: the tapes, the letter, the drawing, the VHS from Echo Rock. I stayed while they cataloged the wall cavity in room 104, though they didn't really need me for that part. I remember the sound it made when they pulled away the last section of drywall, a low groan as if the building itself had been holding its breath for 40 years. One of the agents, a woman maybe in her 50s, stood there for a long time, staring into that hollow space. Finally, she whispered, almost to herself, "There are places even God didn't mean to hear." The motel closed 2 weeks later. The owner didn't fight it. He just handed the keys to the county and left town. They tore the place down before winter came. I went back one last time before the demolition crew started. The neon sign had already been unbolted from the roof, and the gravel lot was empty except for a few soda cans glinting in the sun. I parked near where room 104 used to be and just listened. Even with the walls gone, the silence felt heavy, like the air remembered what happened there. I picked up a piece of plaster from the ground, small enough to fit in my palm, and kept it. Not as a souvenir, just as proof that the place had once been real. When the arrests came, they didn't make much noise in the news. The surviving members of Reverend Harkner's organization had scattered years earlier. Some died, some changed names, some reinvented themselves as counselors or faith healers in other states. One of them, a woman named Rose with a long record of charity work, was tracked to a nursing home in Utah. She was 81 when the agents questioned her. They said she didn't deny it. She just stared out the window and said, "We were told it was for their good, to make them forget." The official charges that stuck were limited crimes of concealment, unlawful confinement, conspiracy to traffic minors across state lines. Most of the original offenders were gone by then. Harkner himself had been dead for a decade, buried under another name in a small church cemetery outside Spokane. But his voice lived on through those recordings, cold and deliberate, like a sermon given to no one. Joanne Langridge was at peace for the first time in nearly 40 years when the FBI returned her son's letter. I went with the agent who delivered it. She sat on her porch reading it slowly, her thumb brushing over the faded pencil lines. She didn't cry, not then, but she smiled in that quiet, trembling way that looks more like release than joy. "He was brave," she said. "I always knew he was brave." We sat there for a long while as the sun went down behind the mountains, the light turning everything the color of copper. When she finally folded the paper, she said she wanted him buried with it when her time came. "He waited for me," she said softly. "Now, I'll wait for him." The podcast episode aired 6 months later. I called it Echoes from Room 104. I didn't sensationalize it, didn't add music or dramatic cuts. I let the story breathe exactly as it was, just voices, quiet places, and the sound of the wind moving through an old vent. I thought maybe a few thousand people would listen. Instead, millions did. Letters and emails came in from people who said they'd stayed at that motel, that they'd seen the man with the glass eye, that they'd lost someone around the same time. Some of those messages were hard to read. A few sounded unhinged, but others felt like small fragments of the same wound. Not long after, the FBI opened a multi-state review of disappearances from 1979 to 1986. They found parallels in Arizona, Washington, and Idaho, similar building modifications, similar taped sessions always connected to church camps or behavioral programs run under different names. It wasn't one cult or one killer. It was a network of belief built on obedience and silence. They called it the Harkner pattern, I never liked that phrase. It sounded too neat, too tidy for something that destroyed so many lives. Mary Ann Lillis moved out of Elko County. The last time we spoke, she was running a small roadside diner in Wyoming. She told me sometimes travelers stop in and mention the case, not realizing she'd once been part of that story. "I just listen," she said. "Sometimes they get the details wrong, but I don't correct them. The truth already had its chance." I think she carries more guilt than she deserves. She was a kid when all this started. She just happened to remember what the rest of the town forgot. As for me, I went home. My apartment in Brooklyn felt different when I got back. Quieter, but not in the comforting way it used to be. I kept waking up at night thinking I heard tapping on the walls, that same 3-beat rhythm. For a while, I tried to convince myself it was just the pipes, the radiator, the noise of an old building settling. But deep down, I knew it wasn't sound I was hearing, it was memory. A kind that doesn't stop when the recorder's off. The letter and the tapes are archived now, sealed in climate-controlled storage at the State Historical Bureau. I visited once during the transfer. They let me hold the red cassette for a moment before it went into evidence. The label had started to flake. The ink almost vanished, but the tape still worked. I asked if I could hear it one last time. They obliged, and we sat in that sterile little room as the machine clicked and whirred. Then came the voice, Benny's voice, soft, tired but steady. "If you knock, I'll knock back." The agent paused the tape, maybe out of instinct, maybe because the air in that room had gone too heavy. "That's enough," she said quietly. I agreed. The Willow Pines site is empty now, fenced off with a small plaque the county put up in 2024. It doesn't mention names, just says, "In remembrance of those who vanished and those who refused to forget." Every time I'm out west, I stop there. It's not a tourist site, just a patch of gravel and wind, but people leave things, flowers, stones, sometimes cassette tapes with no labels. The locals say at night you can still hear the echo of a child knocking if the wind hits the valley just right. I've been there when it happens. It's not eerie, not anymore. It's just quiet acknowledgement, like the land itself learned to listen. Joanne passed away last spring. Her niece sent me the obituary, said she went peacefully in her sleep. They buried her with Benny's letter, just like she asked. When I read that, I felt something loosen in me. Something that had been wound tight since the first night I walked into room 104. The case was closed, but closure isn't what people think it is. It's not neat. It's not an ending. It's more like the moment after a storm when you realize the world's still there, just rearranged. I don't stay in motels much anymore. But sometimes, when I'm on the road for another story, I'll pull into a small town, the kind with one main street and a gas station that still sells cassette adapters. I'll sit in the parked car watching the glow of a porch light across the lot and think about that boy, the one who kept knocking even when no one came. His mother never stopped listening, and in the end that mattered. It brought light to places built to keep it out. I think about faith too. Not the kind preached from pulpits, but the quiet kind. The faith that someone someday will keep looking. That a wall isn't the end of a voice. That a child's words scrawled in pencil 40 years ago can still make strangers stop and care. That's what this story became. Not a mystery solved, but a memory reclaimed. I still have that small piece of plaster from the motel, the one I picked up before they tore it down. It sits on my desk next to the recorder, rough-edged and light. Sometimes, when the night is too quiet and the city hum fades for a second, I tap it gently 3 times. Not out of fear, not to summon anything, just to let him know someone's still listening. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark.